We come now to presentation 11 of Hermetic America Future. And we're beginning to look at the extraordinary visions of the future that especially Hermetic America has brought into play in just the last 3 generations, but in particular in the current generation. One of the great figures in this is A.E. Van Vogt, and this was a portrait done of him in England for the American centenary of 1976, and he wrote an introduction to the volume Visions of the Future, Science Fiction Illustrations in Britain. One of the peculiar things is that Van Vogt occurs in the only issue of a science fiction magazine to be republished as a book by the University of Southern Illinois Press. And the cover of it looks like this from July 1939. This issue of astounding science fiction ushered in what is now called the golden age of science fiction. And that golden age of science fiction lasted from this issue, July 1939, into roughly the early 1950s, and by 1956 had run pretty much its course, a course of about 17 years. What made this issue extraordinary in the first place was it was the initial appearance of A.E. Van Vogt in print in science fiction. The story was called Black Destroyer, and it was followed up by another long, what they call novelettes, something in between a short story and a novelette, called Discord in Scarlet. And Discord in Scarlet became very famous in the 1980s because one of its complex theme matrices was co-opted by other writers and put out as the movie Alien. And I happened to, at the time, know the producers, Ronald Shusett and his wife. They used to walk their little dog on Hollywood Boulevard where I had a bookstore. But I was also very close to Van Vogt, his wife, and Shusett came in and said, but the screenplay was by Dan O'Banion and some others. I thought it was original, and that's why we made the film. He said, I've never read any Van Vogt. Could I borrow from you? And I said, yes, you can. But my copy of the published novel, The Voyage of the Space Beagle, which has Black Destroyer, Discord in Scarlet, and 3 or 4 other stories knit together as a novel. I said it's a first edition, signed by my longtime friend, Van Vogt. And in fact, it is one of the earliest memories that I have of a new scale of science fiction, because I read the paper bound of it that was published in the summer of 1952, published as Mission Interplanetary. I was at the time 11 years old. It's interesting because Van, being a very kingly person, was not after big bucks. Finally, the studios settled on something nominal and minimal, $25,000, in a film that made hundreds of millions of dollars. What is interesting about the Black Destroyer story about Van Vogt, about this issue, is that it was also the first time that Isaac Asimov appeared in a major publication. He had published 2 little short stories in some kind of obscure pulps, but Trends by Isaac Asimov was also the first real appearance of Isaac Asimov. So that Van Vogt and Asimov appeared together in July of 1939 in this issue of Astounding Science Fiction. And Asimov quickly became famous for two kinds of stories. One were stories about robots that were collected together and published. This is the first British edition of I, Robot. I'll bring the first American edition next week, and you'll see what an extraordinary difference in covers that there are. The lead story was called Robbie, and in its first publication in 1940, the title of the short novel, the novelette, was Strange Playfellow. And that story became the basis of the Robin Williams film about a robot that goes through all the permutations and learns to become human. And also a Will Smith movie just a year or so ago, I, Robot, based upon this. Asimov was also famous for a series that finally came together and published as Foundation, with its sequel, Foundation and Empire, and its trilogy completing novel, Second Foundation. Foundation by Asimov is considered the greatest science fiction trilogy ever written. It has been considered so since it was put out in book form in the early 1950s. It concerns the ways in which a far-flung humanity on a galactic scale has been operating under what was laid down as psychohistory. And the founder of psychohistory, right at the beginning of Foundation, at the beginning of the first story that came out in the very early 40s, 1941, Harry Seldon, born in the 11,988th year of the galactic era, died 12,069. The dates are more commonly given in terms of the current Foundation era as minus 79 to the year 1 FE, Foundation era. Born to middle-class parents on Helicon, Arcturus sector, where his father, in a legend of doubtful authenticity, was a tobacco grower in the hydroponic plants of the planet. He showed early amazing ability in mathematics. Anecdotes about his ability are innumerable. Some are contradictory. At the age of 2, he is said to have, and these are in italics and at the beginning of each section throughout the Foundation trilogy, you will have excerpts from Harry Seldon's psychohistory. Now, those of a later generation recognize that Frank Herbert's Dune is also set in a very different science fiction galactic projection in the year 10,000, et cetera, et cetera. Asimov is not the first to be able to do this, but he was one of the finest and the best. These are visionary works. It's important to understand that science fiction is a visionary-based work that extends through a whole ecology of dimensions all the way to science. And that it is called science fiction, but really is a science vision literature. And that science vision is opposed to, in every dimensional way, to a mythology. That a mythology belongs to a cycle of natural integral and occurs as the parenthetical phase of experience that has feeling tones, it has images, It has a language that is largely oral, and that a mythic horizon of experience is a sinuous line, a plot line of beginning, middle, and end stories, myths, that constitute then a mythology, which is the clustering of the myths together into a whole cycle, and that sinuous line of the mythic horizon links together the existential ritual actions that we do and the symbolic structured thoughts that we think. And that the correlation between what we think and what we do is the way in which then lines of identity and referentiality and identification occur naturally in beings like ourselves. The central linking naturally at the beginnings is that myth blossoms out of ritual and comes to a further integral in symbols. But there is a regressive motion going the other way, where the symbolic thought considers itself the final end of the process and closes off only to give special, unusual access to a further phase of visioning. That it is no longer something that is countenanced as a part of the completion of the circle, and that by going outside of the circle of the culminating mental integral is a dangerous and perhaps a perilous endeavor, only to be countenanced in very limited, secured, out of the way, out of the ordinary, out of the place of normal life, so that somebody who tries to just even begin to explore vision is called a daydreamer. Somebody whose intellect, whose head is in the clouds, it's foggy, it's vague, and that if it isn't dangerous and perilous, it's downright chaotic, and erases the certainty of the lines of referentiality, of the identifications that we have learned to make and to depend upon, of the sense of identity, that somehow our body doing these things that correlate with the sense of identity, thinking these thoughts, and correlating together, keep the parentheses very tight on experience so that it will flow in expected ways and not occur in any kind of a static, any kind of a jumble, any kind of real alternatives. And this is called then social certainty based upon practical reality that gives us the experience which we know how to calibrate and how to measure and how to dole it out. And anyone who seeks to try to explore vision beyond this is given very limited conditions. You may go to a monastery outside of society where you will be sequestered, and you will remain there then and not participate in life, not participate in the society. Or you may go at a certain age of adolescence out to explore just a little bit for yourself on something like a vision quest, something like a trip to expand your horizons, but you are expected then to grow up from that and come back and join the social reality, the ritual comportment, so that your experience is calibratable in such a way that our reference, our identifications, and your identity are in sync, and that this is the way the world works. What is difficult is that occasionally someone like a Harry Seldon comes along who learns that vision is maturable into history, and that history is different from myth. Historical experience has a conscious dimension and has an ability to explore possibilities, so it has the ability to experiment. And so someone who has a historical understanding has a historical consciousness that this is one way to look at the way in which things develop, in which actions come together, in which material is harnessed and utilized. But there are also ways to change the materials. It is no longer a flint stone, but is now a flint arrowhead. It is no longer just iron ore, but it is culled and alchemically made into steel with a little bit of carbon in it, and onto better and better elements, so that the physical existentiality of the world can be transformed. And also the symbolic orders of thought can likewise be transformed. That symbols are not limited to an integral, to putting things together and keeping them there, but they can have new perspectives, new ideas, new ways. And one of the primordial tones that changes is that feeling is no longer just an epiphenomenon of rituals, but becomes a new adjunct of experiments. And that one can learn that memory and imagination together are able to bring symbolic nexes, either the symbols or the ideas, into a whole spectrum of possibilities, so that now thought has a rainbow quality rather than an identification specificity, and that what mitigates this is no longer to have a mythic plot line, however tried and true it was for however long it was, that can be changed, because the link between a vision and a history is a new kind of a person. Is not the individual identified with their body, but is a prismatic spirit being who has an affinity not only with the entire cycle of nature, but with a complementary ecology of consciousness that leads into understanding science, and that the science is linked in a complementary way to nature, that not only are physical things transformable, but nature herself is able to be brought into a new relationship with a field just as extensive as nature is. And that extensiveness is the visionary field of consciousness. And that when you bring a conscious nature into play, now what occurs is not just a universe which is identifiable and referentially capable of identifications, but you have a cosmos which is vibrant with energies and possibilities, with dynamics, with prismatic possibilities. And it is science fiction, especially in the United States from 1939 to 1956, that projected a new visionary field of possibility. One of the most interesting aspects of this issue of Astounding Science Fiction, July 1939, is that it also included two brilliant non-fiction elements. One of them was the development Geography for Time Travelers by Willy Ley, L-E-Y. Willy Ley was German originally, came to New York City in the 30s because he did not get along with the Nazis. He was involved with the original group in Germany around Hermann Oberth, who was the developer of rockets in Germany, much like Goddard here in the United States, but on a larger scale, an industrial scale. The scale at Peenemünde on the Baltic Sea, where the young rocket genius was Wernher von Braun, who was very close friends with Willy Ley. And when von Braun was brought to the United States, he found in Willy Ley the perfect ex-German, now become a famous American because his articles ran every single month, science articles in Astounding, and starting in 1950 in Galaxy magazine. And he became the #1 interpreter to the American public of far out scientific ways of educating themselves to what was possible, what was going on, not just on the cutting edge of science, but on the way in which science came out of a richer kaleidoscopic matrix of history and did not occur from myth at all. And that in this case, the Nazi Third Reich was a mythological indoctrination for ritual limitations, whereas the American scene, especially from, as we have seen, the 1890s through into our time, the Hermetic American ethos has been one of opting for a kaleidoscopic history rather than settling for any kind of mythology. And that one of the first steps of weaning oneself away from a mythology is to learn a comparison of many different kinds of mythologies. And the difference was accentuated in the United States, in Hermetic America, by the rapid development of anthropology after the Civil War. And American anthropology from the 1870s up until the 1950s is one of the wonders of the world. There are great anthropologists elsewhere, that is for sure, but it is American anthropology that is the visionary springboard to put into the field the largest number of prismatic anthropologists. And of course, the great sustaining stem of this experimental inquiry concerned the American Indians. That the variety of mythologies of the Indians of the Americas, not just North America, South America as well, that one had the chance to have hundreds of mythologies in comparison, and that the only way to understand them was to develop a kaleidoscopic consciousness of the history of anthropology as an investigation of an enormous spectrum of mythologies, and that it was about equally divided between men and women, but especially in terms of North American anthropology, in terms of American Indian anthropology. With the exception of a few brilliant men, most of the geniuses were women who were able to go to the tribes to live with the tribes, to be welcomed eventually by the tribes as a living member of the tribe. And one of the great developments out of this later on in the 20th century was, for instance, the work of someone like a Jane Goodall of investigating chimpanzees in Gombe in Africa. And she found that the male chimpanzees for 70 million years have been busy patrolling the borders of their territory to protect it from other males from coming in, to keep the female chimpanzees with their sexuality, with their children, with their companionability in the center of the territory, and that the chimpanzees who would wander in from time to time who were female were allowed by patrolling males on the border to come in and join the females, the pool of females in the center. And so even in primate, pre-hominid societies, anthropologically, the women are always welcome to participate in the center. The males are always polarized on the defining territorial boundaries. And that this carries over into all of the primates, into gorillas, into early hominids, into our kind. It is an ingrained mythological horizon and ritual comportment and piecing together on whatever levels of integral are possible, and that the only way that that is changed, one can't obviate it, it destroys the species, but it can be changed, and changed in the sense that it can refine. We face a modern Hermetic America, the next couple of months, where the issue is change. And what is the change? The change is to expand the possibilities and to refine the ability to discern what are the fruitful possibilities to experiment and explore in, so that experience can enrich itself. And that one of the keys to all of this is to not have a closed symbolic mind, but to have a transparent symbol mind, so that the motion of experience can flow through the transparent symbols of the mind and explore the field of visionary possibilities with a preference for a balance between a symbolic mind and a prismatic, artistic spirit personality. And once the symbol and the art of the person, the symbolic thought structures and the art of the spirit person, once they are balanced, they balance on vision. They balance within the field of vision. So that there's an equal balance then extending back from symbols into mythology in a comparative way, and history in a kaleidoscopic way, so that one can have a new understanding of mythology, of any particular mythology, of any particular myth, or of the entire science of anthropological comparative mythologies, balanced with the possibilities of new histories. And so science fiction is, in a way, complemented by an experimental kind of mythology called fantasy. So science fiction and fantasy have a kind of a larger symmetry. And in this way, one can see that myth and history balance within a field of visioning, And the field of visioning has a mythic quality to it, but has a historical quality equally, and one of the forms of expression that characterize that visionary balance are fairy tales. So that the fairy tale has still a living link to mythologies, but it also has equally a living link to histories, and that fairy tales are not just little short things like Cinderella or Red Riding Hood, but they can be large things like Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, which is a fairy tale, which has equally incredibly complex kaleidoscopic histories and incredibly interesting comparative mythologies held in a deep complementarity of vision, so that it appeals at once to our prismatic spirit person and to our symbolic thought integral, which leaves then the expansion to go one step further forward and one step further backward, and those steps are phases, and it means that science and nature have a symmetry to them. The universe of nature and the cosmos of science are related in such a way that they dovetail into a complementarity, and one gets a larger dimension reality. The 4 dimensions of nature and the 4 dimensions of the ecology of consciousness make an 8-dimensional quality of coming together as a 9th dimension, the real. And that 9th dimension has a particular quality. It is a new kind of hyperspace, so that it is not just a 9th, but is a 9, 10, 11. It is a new kind of hyperspace, and that hyperspace now is available as 3 more dimensions to the 8 dimensions, and you get an 11-dimension string theory reality, which is mathematically quite sound, which is scientifically explorable, which is naturally occurable. And in this way, the 21st century now is poised with a new visionary capacity to explore something. One of the things to explore is that there are little kits for children to build UFOs. This happens to be the UFO from Roswell, recovered secretly. And when we come back from the break, we'll see that one of the reasons for this is the tremendous development of science fiction between the summer of 1945 and the winter of 1946. Within literally a 6 or 7 month period, American science fiction underwent a radical recalibration. The recalibration is from the old novels of science, the portable novels of science, edited by Donald Wollheim. The introduction is May 1945, and the best of science fiction, edited by Groff Conklin, the introduction January 1946. In between them is the atomic bomb in New Mexico. These 2 New York City publications, though they're only 6 months apart, are a whole calibration different because of the atomic bomb in New Mexico and White Sands. The atomic bomb was also dropped by the Enola Gay from the Roswell Air Force Base, the only nuclear Air Force base in the world at the time. The Roswell crash is in between White Sands and Roswell. Let's take a break and we'll come back. Let's come back to one of the most crucial eras in human history. It has been likened to the monumental change in our species by the discovery of fire. Let's first look at the portable novels of science. The introduction was by Donald A. Wollheim, and it is dated May of 1945. May 7th, Forest Hills, New York. He had put out in 1943, just 2 years before, a little pocket book. Pocket books were enormously popular in the United States in the 40s, like Penguin books were in Britain in the 1940s. The pocket book had a little kangaroo with a book in the pouch. And the pocket book of science fiction in 1943 was the first time that there was a paperback of science fiction stories. And to make up for the longer novels, Wollheim in 1945 published this. And out of the 4 novels, 2 of them are British. H.G. Wells' The First Men in the Moon, and a work called Odd John by Olaf Stapleton. Odd John is about a mutant who has an IQ that is off the chart. Has an IQ of several million. The other 2 are by Americans. The Shadow Out of Time, H.P. Lovecraft, who was a recluse who lived in Providence, Rhode Island, and was visionarily in contact with the presence of other spirits, other beings, and wrote an incredible new alien mythology happening within our midst. And the 4th, John Taine, Before the Dawn, is a pen name for a famous scientist. But 2 of the novels of science are British, and 2 of the novels of science are American. And it's interesting because Van Vogt is Canadian. So spearheading the golden age of science fiction is someone who is part British, part American, and Van Vogt, because he became one of the first original giants in the field, moved to Los Angeles and lived here for the rest of his life. Lived until actually 2001 in Hollywood, and became one of the big 4 giants of the golden age of science fiction. The other 3, one was Isaac Asimov. Well, I almost said Sir Isaac Asimov, who became the most popular science fiction writer, with the exception of the 3rd of the 4, Robert Heinlein. Robert A. Heinlein and Isaac Asimov have sold more books than any other science fiction writers, very close on them in some respects as Bradbury and Philip K. Dick of later times. Van Vogt, of course, has sold an enormous number too. But Asimov and Robert A. Heinlein were always linked together as some of the most popular writers. The 4th of the big 4 was Theodore Sturgeon, who is always considered the esoteric genius of the lot. He began publishing in later 1939. So all of them came in together at the same time and constituted the core of the golden age of science fiction. The difference is that this first issue of Astounding, as we've talked about, has the first appearance of Van Vogt, first appearance in a major way of Isaac Asimov, had the science article Geography for Time Travelers by Willy Ley, but it had an editorial by the editor of Astounding Science Fiction, John W. Campbell Jr., and the two-page editorial is one of the most startling editorials in world history, because it's the first time that someone of the caliber of Campbell, he was an engineer, he was a scientist, graduate of MIT, had in the earlier 30s become a great science fiction writer under the pseudonym of Don Stewart. One of his most famous short novels was Who Goes There, which was made into a classic science fiction movie, The Thing, which was remade and continues to sell on DVDs and considered one of the great science fiction films of all time, directed behind the scenes by Howard Hawks. John W. Campbell's editorial, called Addenda, is the first time that atomic power was expressed to a wide audience, that it is not only within reach, it is imminent. In the latter part of January, this would be January 1939, the uranium fission atomic reaction was first announced in this country. And of course, the announcement came out of Chicago. It came out of the head of the department that was investigating, Enrico Fermi, who was ably backed up by the great Arthur Compton, and under them, the University of Chicago was the world point at which atomic energy was first pinpricked into actuality. And it was done at the University of Chicago in a secret laboratory underneath the football stadium in Chicago. The importance of that discovery was immediately evident to atomic physicists, and an equally immediate widespread investigation of it commenced. The results of that almost frantic investigation have accumulated so rapidly that the item jackpot, which occupied the editor's page in the April issue, is entirely out of date. Jackpot was an editorial that Campbell wrote in the April issue that first mooted, is it possible that this is going to be something? Robert Heinlein later in the early 1950s wrote a very famous work called Jackpot as well. But by July, just a couple of months later, it was evident to someone of the caliber of John W. Campbell Jr., who was an Hermetic American visionary, that we had not just crossed a line, but we had punctured through a threshold that was of enormous species-changing significance, that man would never again be the same. That page in April ended with the question, can we perhaps put a name on the discoverer of the secret of atomic power? It is no longer a question. Commercial atomic power is entering the technological stage at the present time. This is published in July, but written obviously by early June, late May 1939. The theoretical work is rapidly approaching completion, and practical techniques will grow as progress is made. Then he goes into detail of just how this is occurring in the physics, in the understanding of science, in the puncturing into the scientific field, so that a collection like Wollheim's, the Portables, Novels of Science in May of 1945 was suddenly eclipsed by the publication with the editorial introduction of January 1946 by Groff Conklin, the best science fiction. Instead of 4 novels, you have 40 short stories, powerfully arranged in 6 different topics. And the 6 different topics were the atom, the wonders of the earth, the super science of man, dangerous inventions, adventures in dimension, and then from outer space. The introduction began with an extraordinary insight, because by January of 1946, this is 19 months before Roswell, it was apparent that something had been visioned in science fiction that had come true in ways that were uncannily eerie and in new ways that could never have been understood until it was done. He writes, in the year 1889, Frank R. Stockton, known today largely for his Lady and the Tiger, was writing for a new magazine called Once a Week, which before its first 2 years were run, changed its name to Collier's. And Collier's was a very popular family magazine all the way into the 1950s. In fact, one of the great series that Collier's ran in the early 1950s was a series of books written by Willy Ley, Wernher von Braun, about going into the conquest of space. Another series followed later. These were the years 1952-53, followed by the expedition to the moon, followed by the expedition to Mars, with all of the artists' renderings, with the diagrams laying out the building of the space station, the way in which multiple stage rockets would be used. And Collier's was the magazine that featured these. They were color illustrations. They were 10, 12 pages per issue, and they went to almost every family in America. Middle-class families read the Saturday Evening Post and Collier's and Life and Time, and these were the internet of the day for tens of millions of people. In the year 1889, published in the forerunner of Collier's, Frank R. Stockton, one of the potboilers Stockton turned out for Once a Week was about a future war with Great Britain. It was called the Great War Syndicate. And in this unlikely tale were worked out patterns for a couple of new weapons against which the author felt it would be, for the first time, impossible to build defenses. This is 1889. This is 50 years before 1939. One of them was a giant pincers which disabled British battleships by pulling their propellers out by the roots. Another was a cannon with miraculous powers. So hopelessly fantastic did the Great War Syndicate seem then, and later, that it dropped into a kind of honorable obscurity until recently. It was remembered only by science fiction pioneers like H.G. Wells, who gave Stockton credit for helping him along the road which eventually resulted in The Time Machine, The War of the Worlds, and his other famous science fantasies. However, on August 6th, 1945, the Great War Syndicate suddenly came alive again. Through the purest chance, a chance, let me add, which has not blessed the efforts of many other fantasy writers, the effects of Stockton's miraculous cannon as he described them were uncannily like the atom bomb which eliminated Hiroshima. Much of the mechanics with which he surrounded the weapon is sure nonsense, but something incredibly, vividly, eerily true was there. And deeper than that, one of the things is the description of the Great War Syndicate's instant motor cannon, where instantly the speed that would have been accumulated over time by something like a railroad train was condensed to an instant. The explosion, at the same instant, the sky above the spot where the motor had descended was darkened by a wide-spreading cloud. This was formed of that portion of the water of the bay which had been instantaneously raised to the height of about 1,000 feet. The sudden appearance of this cloud was even more terrible than the yawning chasm in the waters of the bay or the startling shock, but it did not remain long in view. From Day of the Trinity, this is a description of the first atomic explosion, July 16th, 1945. A pinprick of brilliant light punctured the darkness, spurted upward in a flaming jet, then spilled into a dazzling cloche of fire that bleached the desert to a ghastly white. It was precisely 5:29 and 45 seconds a.m. The explosion, within fractions of a second, vaporized everything within several hundreds of yards of ground zero and pulverized the sand, the rock, and in a brilliant, macabre carnival of colors, went through the purples and reds and oranges and left a ghastly quality of almost an iridescent greenish glow in the desert base that was found later on inspection after the mushroom cloud had reached more than 40,000 feet. And finally, when it had dispersed, the first crews in with protective clothing and so forth found that the entire field of ground zero had crystallized into a crater of green glass and became a special kind of radioactive mineral that was passed around to people. What is peculiar about the Great War Syndicate in 1889 is not only the prediction of a ghastly explosive weapon that instantly outdistanced any competition from classical warfare from then on out, but that the syndicate itself was made up in a very peculiar way. The vessels of the syndicate had no individual names. They were termed repellers and were numbered. On this momentous occasion, the director-in-chief of the naval operations of the syndicate were on board repeller number 1 and commanded. These vessels that are just called then R1, R2, R3 are later reproduced by the Majestic 12 in the UFO cover-up from 1947 on. It was originally MJ1, MJ2. Now it changed in the second generation, not just to Majestic 12, but the group was now called the Jasons. So they were J1, J2, and J1, Vice Admiral John Mike McConnell, who is now the head of the National Security Agency of the United States of America. He is the head of the black government, the head of a syndicate that is separate from and independent of all governmental oversight, and has been since 1947, and is now passing into its third generation of organization. The difficulty is that it did not begin with Roswell. It began to gain ground in such a way that this volume, Magic Eyes Only, Earth's Encounter with Extraterrestrial Technology by Ryan S. Wood, signed here by Ryan. And there was a series of events that happened from the spring of 1941 to the spring of 1942 and involved two specific sites in particular. The 1941 site was Cape Girardeau on the Missouri border with Illinois, down near where the Mississippi River has its confluence with the Ohio River. The last city in Illinois is called Cairo, for Cairo, and Cape Girardeau is up the Mississippi on the Missouri side. There was an incident there of a young Baptist preacher being called out in the middle of the night that there had been a terrible air accident some 10 miles outside of their little town, and that they needed to have last rites over the dead and the dying. And so he went out in the middle of the night and discovered that it was not any kind of aircraft he had ever seen, and that the bodies were not human. They were not of this earth. The site was quickly commandeered by U.S. government agents, and everyone was sworn to secrecy. The following year, in February 24th, in the evening to the dawn of February 25th, was here in Los Angeles. This was a report by the chief, the head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff of the United States Military, George C. Marshall, to Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the president. This is early March of 1942. This is a bullet of 6 items culled from the report to FDR. Unidentified airplanes other than the American Army or Navy planes were probably over Los Angeles and were fired on by elements of the 37th California Brigade between 3:12 and 4:15 a.m. These units expended 1,430 rounds of ammunition. As many as 15 airplanes may have been involved, flying at various speeds, from what is officially reported as being very slow to as much as 200 miles an hour, altitudes 9,000 to 18,000 feet. No bombs were dropped, no casualties among our troops, no planes were shot down, no American or Navy planes were in action, investigating continuing. On March 15th, 1942, FDR, with consultation with General George C. Marshall and the top military brass, we were already in World War II. A special unit was set up, the Interplanetary Phenomenon Unit, the IPU. And they were to take control of all of the material and all of the survivors that could be culled were there any events like this to happen. And it turned out later there was a second, more secret report from Marshall to FDR that in fact 2 craft were recovered. 1 craft with dead beings was recovered from the San Bernardino Mountains, and a second was recovered from the waters off the California coast, off of the Los Angeles coast, and that these were the reason why an interplanetary phenomenon unit had to be set up in March of 1942. It is incredible because it is exactly at this time that the golden age of science fiction visioning began to intensify. And when we come next week, we will look at the way in which 1941, 1942 is one of the most extraordinary pairs of years in world history, focused here in the United States, but focused in such a way that only a Hermetic American prism is able to see the scalar in all of its expansive calibration as a set of resonances that has an infinitely extendable harmonic. And that by 2008, we have already been living for some long while on the scale of a harmonic that exceeds what the public socially thinks is there and ritually comports as if it were there, and has a squeezed experiential horizon that in the gentlest possible language is neurotic only if you're crazy, and if you're not crazy, it is psychotic. The normal dimension of experience is in a psychosis mode, which is that it is not only suffering from illusion, which is not real, but is force-fed a belief in that illusion, so it becomes a delusional conviction that when projected stigmatizes anything that does not fit into its delusional conviction and agree with the illusional projective base. The inmates are running the asylum, so that any time it is punctured in a realistic, expansive way, it is, first of all, if it has traction, it is criticized in such a rabid, overwhelming way. If it is not, it is dismissed by non-acknowledgement, as we can well appreciate. What happens is that the scale of what has happened goes into a basic psychology which includes the subconscious and includes a sociology which is not only commandeered into an indoctrination with propaganda, but has been rooted long enough now that several generations have been born, lived, and died within a skew which has run itself so far that the bend of it now seems as if it were like a whirlpool. So that it is closing in upon itself because time forms are quite dynamically real. Because time as the first dimension occurs as the stem by which space spatiality, the three dimensions of space, blossom out from that sap of time dimension. It is elusive and illusionary to curtail experience of time within the constraints of a manufactured ritual limitation and an indoctrinated ideological symbolic structure. But it is a positively death-dealing. It is a psychologically radioactive disease that is terminal. To have the kind of regressive, closed mind and oppressive, enclosed ritual by which the defense of that, the projection of that, the inculcation of that in a delusional, psychotic way continues to shrink the parentheses of what experience is allowed to consider true, real, livable. And finally, because the integral has a built-in capacity in beings like ourselves, it can condense to a single pointedness and vanish in upon itself, leaving a blank. It is not only true of our species, but of any species in any star system in the cosmos, and that evidently there are other species that are equally in this psychotic, delusional, condensing, vanishing parentheses of experience. And it is this quality that makes the Hermetic America experience not only in science fiction, but in the quality of which Hermetic American literary visioning is able to find that only by dissolving the limitations of that parentheses can we escape the vice grip of an ever-shrinking possibility of our lives at all, much less its meaning. Exactly at the time that this was occurring, in 1940, late 1940 to 1942, William Faulkner put together a series of 7 short stories in a book that was eventually published in 1942 as Go Down Moses. It comes from an old American Negro spiritual. Go down, Moses. Go down to the promised land. Tell old Pharaoh, let my people go. It is dedicated to Mammy Caroline Barr, Mississippi, 1840 to 1940. She lived 100 years. Who was born in slavery and who gave to my family a fidelity without stint or calculation of recompense, and to my childhood an immeasurable devotion and love. Faulkner was raised by Mammy Caroline Barr, along with his brothers. It is one of the most deeply peculiar aspects because most of Faulkner's books take place within a fictional county in northern Mississippi called Yoknapatawpha. It's the Indian name for that land. It's the Chickasaw name. And that the so-called fictional city is Jefferson. And here in Jefferson, Faulkner in Absalom, published in late October 1936, he drew a little map like Tolkien's maps in Lord of the Rings. This is Faulkner's map of Yoknapatawpha County, and in red are all the places that he's going to write about all the places that he has already written about, and how all those stories come together. And when one comes to the back of Absalom, you find a chronology. You find a psychohistory that really takes place in the literary works of William Faulkner. And because it takes place there in such a poignant spirit prism way, the history that is made from that spirit prism and the visionary field of possibility is able to go back and change the past into a new past and open what would have been a closed-off death into future, opening it up so that there is a future. In this way, great spirit beings free us in two ways at the same time in a great symmetry of reality. They open up the past so it can be different than what it's supposed to have been, and that the future now can occur in ways that could not be imagined before, could never have been real before, but now, because they're expressed in this way, the Spirit is able to remake the universe into a new cosmic dynamic. That time itself now is able to be renewed, returned back to its primordiality as a first dimension emerging pristinely out of a reality of many dimensions more than just space-time. And to have a concourse now so that human experience is no longer neurotic in its illusions, no longer psychotic in its delusional beliefs in that illusion realm, and vanishes the very shapes that hold false ideological social realities into their shape, so that they are no longer able to hold their shape. They literally vanish like a heat wave, and that the past, which was so solidly inculcated, becomes fertile and fruitful again. Like in the Beatles' Yellow Submarine, once the Blue Meanies are defeated, everyone can pick up the instruments and start playing music again. The flowers will come back, the birds, and we will come out of those holes, because those holes were not holes. They were momentary insights that punctured the falsity. And once the falsity was vanished, the holes became the further dimensions of real spirit space. Now we know how many holes it takes to fill the Albert Hall. More next week.